Retro gaming in 2023 is a totally different beast than it was back in the day. There are so many different ways to play your favorite games, be it through emulation, through owning, the original cartridges, or through re-releases in some official capacity. A lot of games really can't be played except on the original releases that they had, especially a lot of Nintendo titles are locked pretty much to their original cartridges and haven't been re-released in any other capacity. So that's when something like the NES Classic is appreciated. There might only be a handful of games on it, but it is an official way to play a ton of NES classics on one little system. The downside is the dinky controllers. Not only are the controller's cables way too short, but when you sit down and play 2, 3, 5, 10 hours of your favorite NES game, you'll have the calluses to show for it. Playing a lot of classic arcade games, shmups, and fighters on the NES can really hurt. The NES Classics controller is just a one-for-one recreation of the original NES gamepad, and remember back in the 80s, this was still the early days of home console controllers. It was still perfectly acceptable to have a calculator and rotary knob for a controller, or one button and a really flimsy joystick. So even though it brought a lot of innovation, doesn't quite hold up to today's modern standards. But even back in the day, people yearned for something a bit more intimate than that little rectangle. And that's where we got the NES Advantage. This bad boy is an arcade stick made first party by Nintendo for the original NES system. It had everything the standard controller did, but in a more arcade-style finish. You have your two A and B buttons, now big old and clickety, and instead of a D-pad, you now have an arcade stick, complete with orb. Your start and select are off to the side, so it's a whole lot harder to accidentally hit them. But the Advantage also brought a handful of new thingamabobs and who's-a-whats. These two buttons above A and B are the turbo buttons. Those can be clicked into an on or off position indicated by the light here. Turbo, for the layman, is when you hold down the A or B button, it registers as a rapid click. Instead of one input, it's repeated inputs the longer you hold it down. And this knob controls the speed of that repeated input. Really handy in bullet hell games like Contra, or shmups like Gun-Knack or Xevious. That way you don't wear out your thumb pressing over and over again, or in this case, your entire wrist. You also had a switch here for player 1 or player 2, depending on which port you were plugged into, and a button for slow. Just like in Turbo, it can help with those particularly overwhelming games where there are bullets all over the screen and you just need a little space to catch your breath. Now personally, as a real gamer, I don't really use those types of functions, but to each his own. The NES Advantage lived up to its name. That turbo and slow function gave you an edge, an advantage in those particularly difficult games. But the reason I love this thing so much isn't because it gave me some unfair advantage. It's because it's a whole lot more comfortable. The Advantage brought the arcade experience into the home console market, which was a fantastic thing. But nowadays, in our Nintendo Switch Onlines and our NES Classic eras, there really isn't as many options. Yeah, sure, there's tons of crazy expensive arcade sticks that you can get to use for all sorts of different consoles, but the days of accessories like the NES Advantage seem to be long over. Now we have $80 DualSense 5s and dinky little Fisher-Price Joy-Cons. And in the case of the NES Classic, we had those short-corded original NES controllers, which, if I'm gonna sit down and play a lot of NES, I'm gonna need something a bit more comfortable. That is where this comes in. This is the Edge joystick made by Emio, who knows, at Interworks. This is pretty much a clone of the Nintendo NES Advantage, but this time, instead of having your 7-pin NES connectors, it has the Nintendo Nunchuck connector. This is for the NES Classic as well as the Wii U. Now, the Wii U's virtual console has been shut down for quite a while. For a very long time, the only way to officially play lots of your NES Classic games without owning the original cartridge and consoles was purchasing and downloading digital copies on the Wii U Virtual Console. And as with many digital-only platforms, it is now dead. And all the things you bought with it are gone as well. So I'm pretty much just going to look at this as an NES Classic accessory. So let's crack this baby open and see just how cool it actually is. Ooh. Whoa! There's cooler stuff than I thought there'd be in here. Alright, so out of the box we have the Edge. which is a neat little name that a little homage to Advantage. It gives it the edge. Okay, so we have the Edge joystick instruction manual. This is cool. It's got that sort of vaporwave grid as well as the blue gradient with stars, just like the classic NES stuff, as well as classic edition cheat codes by Emio. This is awesome. Wow, this is a full color cheat code manual. Castlevania, Donkey Kong Jr., man, Bubble Bobble, Balloon Fight, Adventures of Link, Legend of Zelda, Tecmo Super Bowl, Mario Bros, Pac-Man, Kirby. It's got all your classics. I had absolutely no idea that this was in the box. It probably says it somewhere on here. Yeah, bonus cheat book included. It's not like it's on the front of the box or anything. It's not like I could have read that before I started recording the video or anything. I just love when companies throw in things like this that give you so much more than just the thing in a box. It's an experience, opening this thing up and giving you something to hold in your hands and flip through. An experience more than just, cool, machine plastic. Things like this are what endear third-party companies to my heart. Companies like Hyperkin and Evercade, they do a lot of stuff like that, and it just makes me smile when I open the box. So right off the bat, the first thing I notice is that this thing is lighter. Most third-party controllers tend to be lighter than their originals, but to be fair, in the NES Advantage's case, it did have like a full metal plate on the bottom to weigh it down so you had the arcade experience. This one is just a plastic construction, but it still has those rubber grippy feet, and if you notice, it is taller and bulkier, so that gives you a bit more mass and heft, so you don't have to really worry about it sliding around. This actually slides around a lot less than this one does, because this one is missing a rubber foot. Okay, so besides those sizes and the Nintendo logo, the differences I am noticing, number one, is the joystick. This joystick is taller and has one of those... I didn't realize that was going to screw off, but that means you could replace this with a different shape if, you're an enthusiast and you like different joystick shapes, sizes, or if you're Baby Yoda and you like playing with it. Yeah, this feels more like a standard 8-direction joystick. It's got that little disc here that sort of sits on top and sort of slides around as you move the joystick, whereas this one has a sort of raised and then seated in stick, and it doesn't have the clickety registration that this one does. For something like the NES where you're replicating a gamepad, it is kind of nice to have that auditory and tactile registration of hitting those directions, whereas here you can be pushing in all sorts of directions and sort of not being sure about where you're going. It's not as much of a problem in shmups, but definitely a problem with platformers. Another thing I noticed right off the bat is that these A and B buttons are larger. They're also a bit more standard arcade cabinet buttons than the A and B here. The Advantage just feels like oversized NES buttons where you have your sort of gummy membrane contacts, but the edges have that raised red ring around the buttons as well as a clickier contact where you can feel the registration. Again, for something that's supposed to mimic an arcade cabinet experience, that's a big plus. Now, everything else is pretty much laid out exactly the same, except all of the buttons have been shifted up one. Instead of the 1-2 player switch, we now have select, and right under that we have start. Then we have slow, and the very last button is B and A, so you don't have to rely on being able to hit both of them at the exact same time. If, you're not a pro gamer like I am, you can just press that BA button and be done with it. That's a handy little addition that also maintains the actual look and layout of the original Advantage while taking an outdated switch and replacing it with something useful. Smart design. The turbo buttons are pretty much exactly the same. All of these buttons, besides the 4 select, start, slow, and B and A, feel a whole lot clicketier. You can feel that scrolling in there, where the only one that really feels like that on the Advantage are the turbo buttons, just because they press in. So overall, in feel and form factor, I kind of really like the Edge. This thing feels like what the Advantage was really trying to do back in the 80s, but without, 30, 40 years of experience in manufacturing. I am also a big fan of the raised and bulkier design because the Advantage kind of feels a little small and weird on my wrists because, you know, I'm not a 10-year-old boy that this was originally designed to market to. But this one, I feel like I have a bit more room and relaxation with my wrists, but still have the ability to game. And on top of all of that, they managed to maintain the look of the original Advantage really well. Of course, you don't have the Nintendo NES Advantage, you just have the EMEO logo, and even the fonts are really similar. This thing is a really solid recreation of the Advantage with newer, modern quality of life improvements, and man, that's all I could ask for. I'm seeing things I didn't notice before in the bag that I probably should have opened. Well, okay, we'll save that for a second. But we do have our long cable here, which is a huge bonus when talking about the NES Classic, because the controllers that came with that sucked doo-doo. You pretty much had to get a controller extension. But this is like about a 6-foot cable. Yeah, I'm gonna say, let's see, I'm 6'2", so wow, okay, that's like 7.5 feet. That's all the controller length you're really gonna need. But it also had this. So you know how I accidentally screwed off the orb? You also get an elongated knob. So you can just screw this puppy off here, give that to your dog or your kid to choke on, and then you have your knob here. This sort of gives you more of a side control joystick experience than the sort of on top, you know, shorter orb. I don't know the terms, but I do know that enthusiasts are really happy with options like these, and a lot of people that, you know, are into custom arcade cabinet builds and things like the arcade one-ups and even restoring original arcade cabinets really do like to have customizable joysticks where they can pick the one that feels the best in their hands, that they enjoy using the most. I don't want to make a joke about that because you'll sue me. Never mind. Forget I said anything. Wrestle this back from your dog. Personally, I do think I like this one more, but this one, it's got the look. So what I did notice on the side of the box is it gives you a little rundown here. Number 1, turbo. The turbo functions allow repeated button presses by holding the turbo button. The turbo knobs control the speed of the buttons, and the on-off buttons activate the turbo function, and turbo function on A and or B buttons. Sorry. The joystick is a digital 8-way input with a circular gate. You can switch between the classic ball-top joystick and the bat-top joystick. Okay, you know, we got ball and bat, you know, if you want to be NES. Does anyone notice that? NES and NES? Like NES from Earthbound? His name's pretty much Nintendo Entertainment System. Wait, no, his name is Nintendo Entertainment System, Super. Guys, I just cracked the code. The joystick brings the arcade feel to your home and works especially well with games that use 8 directions. Yes, it does. It also says microswitch. The A and B microswitches with higher end and long-lasting material, these buttons are the best choice for any fighting game enthusiast. There's the answer. Yes, these are higher quality microswitch arcade buttons. And they do feel pretty dang good. Top 2 buttons function as select and start. The bottom 2 are the slow and B and A buttons. The slow button will give an edge over those using a normal controller by making the game go in slow motion. The B and A button makes it easier to execute certain moves, requiring the player to press both the A and B button. It makes BA moves easier to execute with more accuracy. Yes, it means if, you know, you're doing a combo in a fighting game, you can hit that B and A, and you'll hit that BA input every time, so you don't have to trust on the accuracy of both your fingers hitting those micro switches at the same time. Yeah. This is a nifty little machine. Now, unfortunately, I do not have an NES Classic in the studio to test this out with because those things sell pretty much as soon as we get them in at Nostalgic. What I would be interested in knowing is if this works with jailbroken Nintendo Classics, because that would make this thing almost a must-have accessory for people who have loaded tons of other games onto their NESs, which I am not encouraging, by the way, because that would be illegal. We get calls asking all the time at Nostalgic if we have those little mini Nintendos that have 500 plus games on them, and every time I have to say, I'm sorry, technically those are bootlegs. The official ones have like, what, 22 games on it? It's got some classics. You know, it's got Castlevania, it's got Mario, it's got Metroid, We actually can't sell those because they are illegal. But I mean, for the sake of knowledge, for science, I'm curious. So if you have one of these and you have a jailbroken NES Classic or one of those small bootleg ones that have a bajillion games on them, leave me a comment and let me know if it works with random games. I'm really interested to find out. And hey, while you're down there, maybe leave us a like. Maybe hit that subscribe button. Maybe even click that bell icon so you don't miss any of our other awesome videos. We have tons of videos on nostalgic video games going over different third-party and OEM accessories and new consoles and new games that we get coming out, as well as tech videos, podcasts, toy content, and more. This video was not sponsored. Everything I said is just my opinion. The purpose of these videos is to give you guys an objective look at these third-party accessories that may or may not be on your radar. And honestly, if you have an NES Classic, I say this is a must-have. Thanks for tuning in to Nostalgic Video Games, and we'll see you guys next time.